Council and National Education Committee. Thank you, Alicia, for your continued support of the National Diversity Council and for moderating today's event. Alicia, I will pass it off to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily, for the introduction. I'm excited to be moderating this discussion and offering solutions for supporting employee mental health that are in tune with the complexities of today's world. Creating an inclusive and diverse workplace requires a deliberate and flexible approach. So our event today aims to equip organizations with the necessary tools and strategies to address diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges, particularly during political polarization. The national chapter meetings aim to ignite thought and action in a focus group setting addressing DEI and belonging in the context of personal, professional, community, and organizational advancement. We want to address challenging topics and frame conversations with strategies and a deeper understanding of how to move forward. A more casual alternative to formal training and seminars, chapter meetings energize and empower change agents to join our community with a mutual goal of creating awareness, education, and best practices. To learn more about our upcoming events, please visit our website, nationaldiversitycouncil.org. Before we begin our panel today, I just want to give you all a few housekeeping rules. If you have questions for our panelists, please send a private message to Emily Pfister, who will be writing a note in the chat box now so you can find her. Emily will keep track of the questions to be addressed at the end of the session. Following our Q&A segment, should you wish to continue engaging, we invite you to join our optional After the Chapter session. The After the Chapter provides an opportunity to extend discussions with the panelists while fostering deeper interaction between panelists and audience members. In addition, this event provides one HRCI and one SHRM credit. Details will be provided at the conclusion of the program. At the end of today's program, please give us your thoughts in our event survey. There will be a QR code provided, and you can access the survey by hovering your camera over the QR code to open the link. Your input helps us understand what went well and identify areas for improvement. Your feedback is essential in shaping future events and ensuring we provide content and experiences that resonate with you. A special thank you to our corporate partners, Executive Leadership Council, Advisory Council, community partners, volunteers, speakers, staff, and guests. Your unwavering support and dedication to DEIB make our efforts possible and impactful. At this time, I'm excited to introduce our panelists. You can find their detailed bios on the National Diversity Council website. I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Deborah Van Horn, who is a behavioral health clinician at Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, and also a licensed psychologist. Dr. Joe Charette is the program director of the Master's in Professional Clinical Counseling program and associate professor at LaSalle University. And Robert Braylock is a grant writer, healthcare professional, educator, and unity, equity, and justice practitioner at BHK Consulting, LLC. Welcome, everyone, to the virtual stage. I'm going to start with our first question, and I believe this one is for Deborah. How can organizations create a psychologically safe environment where employees feel comfortable discussing mental health concerns without fear of stigma and retaliation? And I'm hoping you can also define psychological safety for us as well.
Okay, sure. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, so as far as this notion of psychological safety, it's certainly not a new idea. It can be traced, for example, to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and that need to belong. But it is newer terminology and specifically applied to the workplace. So psychological safety is characteristic of workplaces that are conducive to engagement, to learning, contributing, innovating. At the most basic level, people need to feel safe to bring their authentic self to work. And that certainly sounds buzzy, but when we don't feel safe, we're motivated primarily to protect ourselves and to avoid harm rather than moving towards more positive goals. So when we're safe to be ourselves, we're free then to move forward. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that the workplace becomes a free for all. Obviously, there are still going to be standards for performance and behavior. So for starters, there are all the things you do to promote psychological safety generally, many of which really boil down to treating people with respect in every interaction. If the general atmosphere and tone is one of respect, then you're halfway there. If it isn't, then you probably have some basic work to do before looking specifically at mental health concerns. Um, so thinking about psychological safety to bring up mental health or mental illness concerns, um, one message to send is that mental health or behavioral health is health. So considering language around health and wellness is emotional resilience as well as physical health included as a target or goal of your workplace wellness program. Do you include references to mental health when discussing use of benefits such as sick time, insurance, or EAP? Are mental health issues or neurodiversity included among other forms of difference that are addressed in your DEIB training? We've been lucky at Horizon in a way because as a managed care organization, some of the initiatives we've undertaken to serve members better have kind of the dual effect of increasing psychological safety in-house. So training initiatives around understanding behavioral health diagnoses and treatment, mental health parity, integration of physical and behavioral health all send the message that behavioral health is health and kind of normalize talking about it. Also, a really potent way of engendering safety is through modeling. Um, are you demonstrating and rewarding the behavior that you want to see? What happens when somebody mentions a mental health concern? So, leaders may wish to consider their comfort level with discussing physical versus behavioral health issues and seek to close the gap if there is one. If, as leaders, it might seem normal to mention that you have a dentist appointment over lunch, but weird to say that you have a psychiatrist appointment, or if you would be comfortable saying that you need to stand up during a meeting because of your sciatica, but uncomfortable saying it's because you can pay attention better with your ADHD. Consider why that is, what it means for everybody else in the room and everybody else in the organization. And I'm focusing on leadership because modeling vulnerability really needs to start with those who are in the positions of power, who have that kind of capital to spend. An example I can give in one of our most recent behavioral health all employee town hall meetings, some of the leaders within the organization, up to the VP level, were sharing their own personal or familial experience with mental health and substance use disorder as a way of kind of normalizing and destigmatizing. So the more it's out there on the table as a normal thing that we talk about, the more it becomes a safe and normal thing to talk about.
Thanks, Deborah. So I heard you say three things, right? Creating respect in the workplace, modeling vulnerability, and really integrating mental health into those conversations in the same way we might integrate health issues into the conversation. I want to open it up for Joe and Robert if you have anything to add or respond to.
I really just want to highlight something that Deborah said, that piece about not creating workplaces that are conducive to safety and authenticity motivates people to protect themselves. And purely from a getting your work done perspective, if you have to spend all of your time protecting yourself from your work environment, a place where we arguably spend at least a third of our time, sometimes maybe more, can that person actually even get their work done, the things that you actually expect them to do? And that just really stands out to me. So I really appreciate Deborah saying that.
I'll second what Deborah said about just like the more basic things. So love, intentionally choosing to be kind. I think that goes a long way.
Thank you both. Our next question is going to be for Joe. How does the workplace environment impact the mental health of individuals from diverse backgrounds?
Great question, Alicia. I am going to start with the negative, and I'm going to try to kind of what I call therapeutically weave the things that you can do that beneficially impact everybody in your workplace, not just your employees or your supervisees from diverse backgrounds. But I do want to highlight, though, that if you are attuned to and committed to the needs of those who might be underrepresented in your workplace, you are also benefiting the people who have majority identities and who have more privilege than some of these underrepresented folks, right? Because if you're focusing on the person with the most need in the space, everybody else's needs are likely also met, and then you make accommodations where necessary. And kind of dovetailing off of what Deborah said, I think one of the things that drastically negatively impacts folks from diverse backgrounds in the workplace is the inability to show up authentically as who you are in a professional space. And I see that also tied to having a singular idea of what professional looks like. Because we now know that there are some kind of notions in the domain of professionalism that are directly tied to elements of systemic oppression, right? And that the workplace can kind of recapitulate some of those things that underrepresented folks or diverse individuals might experience out in the world. And so if your workplace becomes just yet another place where you feel like you don't belong, or you actually feel unsafe, or you might feel like there is a kind of threat to your overall well-being, that is something that is, of course, going to negatively impact the people in your workplace. And so having first, throwing, I would honestly say, I'll be a little extreme about this. Throw out your idea of what professionalism looks like and talk to the people who show up in your space about what professionalism means to them. And the best example I can give is I'm about to start a new job, and the culture there is very you wear a suit and tie every day. And you'll say, I'm wearing a t-shirt right now. I don't wear a suit and tie every day. It just doesn't work for me for several reasons. I find ties to be really uncomfortable. And as a neurodivergent person, having something around my neck all day, and I don't want to shout out Robert because I know you're wearing a tie right now, right? But that's not something that works for me. But I felt safe enough with my new CEO to say, like, look, that's something that's not going to work for me. So is there something that I can do to still meet the professional dress code here that also makes me feel comfortable to show up as myself and be comfortable all day? And the other piece I felt comfortable to share with my CEO is ties to me feel really masculine, and that messes a bit with my gender as a queer person. And so I don't want to have that being what clouds my space instead of being able to do my job. And the way that my CEO was able to facilitate that conversation was simply by asking me what I needed, and also creating the space where I knew I could say exactly what I needed, and that wasn't going to be met with, oh, we can't do that, or that's, that doesn't work here, but being able to work with me. Now, some of the other things that I think set that up to where I could have that conversation is in my interview process, there was a space given for me to talk about who I am as a person, not just as a professional, and how I balance that personal and professional in the workplace. So there was already kind of that culture of safety. And so I think at the very minimum, asking people what they need, really challenging your idea of what quote unquote professionalism looks like, and making space for people to do professionalism differently. And I want to touch on something that Deborah said as well. It doesn't mean that the workplace is a free for all, but you also have to trust that your employees might be able to handle a different definition of professionalism, right? And if they can't, then maybe you shouldn't have hired those people to come into your workplace, or maybe there's other things that you can do to support that person. But we have to stop equating not having one kind of box that everyone can fit into with a free-for-all, and really embrace the kind of ambiguity and diversity of how people can show up.
Thanks, Joe. Deborah and Robert, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I can jump in because I really wanted to echo the idea that if we're supporting those who may be the most vulnerable or have the most needs, then we're supporting everyone. And not necessarily, what I'm hearing Joe say is not necessarily to assume what people need, but to ask what people need, which doesn't seem like it should be as sort of revelatory as sometimes it is. It seems like sometimes there's kind of this idea that we should be guessing or somehow knowing without asking, and that having that conversation um, and normalizing that conversation can go a long way.
Thanks, Deborah. Robert, did you want to add anything?
Just the word cultural humility, and this understanding that our reality is not the center of realities, and that there are different ways of expression and different ways of living life that are not inferior or superior to our own. And so just understanding that people have different definitions, people have different definitions and different contexts for different things.
Robert, can you define what cultural humility is for folks who may not know what that term means?
I can, thank you, because that was a very specific term. So thank you for asking that. Cultural humility is really taking a posture of being open to learning and understanding about differences. And we differentiate it from cultural competence. Cultural competence may be defined as like almost like a check mark, like you've done this type of coursework, or you've spent this many amount of hours with a certain demographic, versus cultural humility, which is really an ongoing process.
Great. And Robert, we're going to stick with you for our third question. So are there any unique stressors or challenges faced by employees from underrepresented backgrounds that organizations should be aware of?
Yeah, I think Joe, not I think Joe definitely hit on this a little bit earlier. So it's some people, some individuals, some groups of people are coming into workplaces with different stressors than other people. So I think about some of the work that we do in Chicago. So the Chicago Department of Public Health, this was back in 2020 or 2021, released a report called "The State of Health for Blacks in Chicago." And so a few of the things that they showed in there, in addition to the 9-year life expectancy gap between blacks and non-blacks, was the rate of serious psychological distress. And it showed that black people experience that at a higher rate than non-black people, and then black women even more specifically than black men. And so, I mean, we think about the tech industry, and there are many stories, unfortunate stories about black and brown people leaving that industry specifically in droves. And so when we understand the context of, as Joe mentioned, systematic oppression, we have to, or we don't have to, but as leaders, we should choose to take that into consideration. And so if we know, generally speaking, this is not everybody, this may not even be the majority, but if we know, generally speaking, that there are certain demographics of people who experience different stressors than we do, there are some things that we want to do preemptively to address those within the workplace. I think a simple strategy, and this is one that we do it just as really as a unity, equity, and justice organization. We invest in youth. So we do work with elementary school students. As organization leaders, one of the simple things that you can do to begin building psychological safety is to invest in K-12 students, really, especially within the places that you have business. And so by doing that, one, you're building rapport with those students at a very early age, and it's very inexpensive as well. But you're also helping to expose them to the culture of your organization. Hopefully, it is a healthy culture, or a culture that's trending more towards healthy, trending in a healthier direction. And so that begins to build trust. And so there's less that you have to do kind of like on the back end, because you've been intentionally, even systematically, and consistently building trust since they were in kindergarten or preschool. And that takes way less dollars than it does to try to recruit somebody. So investing, 20 hours a quarter in a local school is significantly less than it takes to go out and recruit somebody. And so I think that's a very simple and practical strategy that organizational leaders can use.
Thanks, Robert. Deborah or Joe, did you want to add anything or comment on?
Yes, because the last thing that Robert said before he started answering this question, and then also you kind of wove through this, you made me think of something I totally forgot about that impacts the mental health of underrepresented people in the workplace. Is you as a whatever kind of leadership position or HR, but just another person who works with people who might be different from you, be in touch with what's happening outside of your workplace, because you can't expect someone who, and I'll speak from my own life, it's important for the person that I work for to know that there's, I don't know, at any given time, 500 or 600 anti-LGBTQ bills in active legislation across the United States. And there's no way for me to come into work and pretend that kind of thing doesn't impact me. Now, it is incumbent upon me as an employee to manage how much that might affect me in the workplace and to be realistic about that. But to ask me to completely separate myself from my identity in the workplace creates what Deborah was talking about earlier, where I'm going to spend more time protecting myself instead of actually doing my job. And the same goes for anything like, you can't pretend for someone who might be an immigrant or an international student or employee. You can't pretend that there's not anti-immigrant or anti-international rhetoric happening in our country and expect that person to not be affected by that if something kind of recapitulates that in the workplace.
Deborah, did you want to add anything?
I think I was where I was kind of associating to with some of this is also this idea that your employees, even if sort of the surface issue, employees or coworkers, essentially may in some ways live in a different world than you do. And that encompasses, that's sort of the social, the political, the again, coming back to health and building on what Robert was saying, the healthcare disparities, and even if you have a geographically dispersed workforce, even here in New Jersey, some people are going to be more affected by forest fires than others. So that kind of takes things away from the specific arena that we're considering, but that recognizing that everybody may not be living in the same world that you're living in for a number of different reasons.
Thanks, Deborah. And I'm glad Robert brought up cultural humility earlier, because what I'm hearing is a theme of, talking to your employees, getting curious about what's happening and doing some of your own work about what's happening in the space around you and nationally and globally too. So Deborah, I'm going to come back to you for our next question. What training or education should be provided to managers and HR professionals to better support the mental health needs of diverse populations?
Okay, so it is important to recognize that, of course, that managers and HR professionals are going to have different training needs, because the HR professionals are going to be in the position of really setting the company-wide policies and standards, and managers are going to be out there on the front line implementing. But I think there are some points that are relevant across the board. One being that I think mental health is so often seen as kind of a niche or specialty area that it's very easy to forget that mental health disorders are very common. And in recent years, the prevalence has stayed pretty steady in national surveys. About 1 in 5 adults meet criteria for at least one mental health disorder. And this is excluding developmental disorders, neurodiversity, substance use disorders, and milder forms of, stress or anger management issues that may impact the workforce. So I'm talking 1 in 5 adults, and uh, so this is affecting a lot of us. And again, I always, when doing workplace training, am using inclusive language. This is not those people. This is us. It's 20% of us. Another point I think for everyone to be aware of is that, as with physical health, mental health encompasses a really wide range of issues and severity. So mental health needs are going to range from wellness and the things that we do to be physically healthy and resilient also support emotional health and resilience. Um, there's stress management, there's acute episodes of illness, there's management of chronic illness, accommodations either short term or longer term for disability. Certainly, people need to be aware of the applicable laws and regulations around things like mental health parity, the way ADA may apply to mental health and accommodations. Um, but also setting appropriate expectations. What kinds of conversations do we expect managers to be able to have around mental health issues? And be sure that everybody's aware of what the available resources are. And don't have to make this up. CDC, National Institute on Occupational Health and Safety, NIOSH, they have toolkit materials. We've paid for them with our taxes. Go out and use them. So there are toolkits, there are resources around approaches such as supportive supervision, where the manager doesn't become a counselor, but is able to start a conversation when needed and refer somebody to relevant resources. And this is probably characteristic of our own approach. Even on our clinical teams, where everybody has a clinical license, your boss is not your counselor. There's somebody who can open a discussion and about whether a mental health issue is present or needs to be addressed, or respond to your bringing up a concern, and refer to appropriate resources. Also want to mention that we should recognize, everybody should be aware and conscious that because mental health issues still tend to be stigmatized, that there may be some concerns or pushback when introducing training around addressing those needs. And getting back to that psychological safety, really setting an expectation that all questions are good questions, and to be willing to listen to and explore and respond to possible pushback. Um, and I can give an example. This isn't exactly pushback, but it's kind of a little bit tangentially related. But a while back, I was asked to do some overview training on behavioral health for one of our member-facing teams, not in clinical position, uh, because team members were experiencing some discomfort around working with members with mental health diagnoses. And rather than ignoring or trying, or sort of punishing that discomfort because it's sort of the wrong opinion, it's the wrong take, uh, the leaders there ask the behavioral health team for training to address it. So when you can set a tone that rewards people for raising a concern, rather than punishing them for having the concern, then it can be addressed in the relevant and appropriate training.
Thanks, Deborah. You mentioned 2 toolkits, and as you were talking, I was jotting down, right? How do we train these managers to have these conversations? Could you drop the toolkits in the chat if you can quickly find them?
I will do my best, and if I can't quickly find it, I'll email after the fact.
Great. And I'll do a quick search as well. Joe, Robert, anything to add or react to what Deborah shared with us?
I think something, just to speak broadly, I don't have a suggestion for a specific training, but something I want to, this is more about a culture shift of the way of looking at training in the workplace. in my work in disability justice advocacy, something that we often find ourselves saying is that folks who are trying to support disabled employees, even event attendees who have disabilities or different abilities, is we always go straight to the ADA and we focus on what we absolutely have to do instead of what we could be doing. And that's really what I want to shift around this kind of training. Is there is, you might work in a place where there is a mandatory DEI training, and that is certainly helpful, but treat those things as the basics, right? Of teaching people what they need to know, but then you need to be looking beyond that, or training your management or leadership, or even even the staff, to look beyond just what we're required to do by law or what we think would be helpful, and consider what we could be doing to make people more comfortable and safe in the workplace, to really be their authentic selves. One of the things that gets talked about in my work often is that, I work in a building that is accessible by legal standards, but is absolutely not usable for anybody with a mobility device. And that's really the difference there. We have met the burden of need, but we haven't actually supported people to be in the space.
I think, yeah, no, for sure. I want to stick with like the youth, because I think it's a great place to invest in terms of, multiple layers, specifically for employers and leaders, though, from a workforce development space. And so the Office of Minority Health, back in 2022, I think it's 2022 or 2023, they came out with a funding opportunity that focuses specifically on Black youth mental health. So there are approximately, I think, 8 different organizations that are working on that grant. Morehouse School of Medicine is one of them. And so I will try to grab some of their resources and provide them to you, Alicia, to send out to the rest of the attendees. But I think as Joe was mentioning, like, we have to get beyond like compliance. Like, that's is necessary, and like, we want people to thrive and prosper and flourish, not just like not just exist. Like, we want people to thrive. And so that takes a different type of investment, or it can take a different type of investment than just simply meeting compliance standards.
Thank you both. All right, I'm going to come back to Joe now. How can organizations measure the effectiveness of their efforts to promote mental health equity and inclusion in the workplace?
Absolutely. There's a couple different things you can do. There's obviously some formal assessments that you can do, and that might be as simple as, something I have to do in my the graduate program I'm the director of, is I have to send out a student survey every year and just ask people about a large kind of battery of different things, their experiences with different campus services and that kind of thing. And I use that data to make recommendations to the program or to my dean as to say, this is what I'm seeing show up. I think you also have to make spaces for qualitative data, especially because many of the formalized assessments or surveys that we use, even if they're anonymous, sometimes people are reluctant to fill them out because they don't know what's going to be done with the data. I just did a feedback survey for my university's administration, and I put some quite critical feedback in there. And I will admit, even in my position, I was like, oh gosh, I hope this doesn't come back negatively on me because of some of the experiences that I have had. And I hope that it is critical feedback that is taken with my intention to, I want the institution to grow. I want it to be better, and I want it to actually be meeting the needs of the people who are in the space. But my bias is toward qualitative feedback because I'm a qualitative researcher, and I really want the narrative of how people are experiencing things. And sometimes that can be done through a focus group. Sometimes that can be done through individual meetings with the people on your team. I think one of the things that as a leader or a manager or a supervisor that you can do to facilitate that kind of conversation is share with whoever you're supporting or whoever works with and for you, your own feedback about your own progress or your own performance, and really encouraging that kind of critical self-evaluation. I have found it goes a long way that I am open with my staff and my faculty about where I think I could have done better, so that they feel comfortable to also provide critical feedback to me. And you have to create that kind of two-way culture of where feedback can be given to you. And also don't do it just in the performance review space. Don't tack it on to, oh, is there anything else that we could be doing to support you? Make it regular and consistent, whether that's at your staff meetings, it's anonymous, and anonymous, if people still do anonymous feedback boxes, right? If that's something. But my students have the option to, at any time during the program, do anonymous feedback about their advisor. And that's something I have to regularly pay attention to. But I cannot stress that importance of creating that culture where the feedback can be given directly to you. Because if you're in a space where that feedback can't be given directly to that leader or to that manager, then first of all, you're missing a lot of data. You also have to look at your culture as a whole. Is this a space where people are afraid to talk to me because of policy, because of the way that I interact with people? And you, as a leader or a manager, have to be willing to take that critical feedback. And again, it should be done in a way that's respectful and growth focused. I don't invite anybody into my office to cuss me out, but I do create a space where they can give their honest, unfettered feedback to me, because that's what I'm going to do to them as a supervisor. And so I know, like Deborah, you said earlier that something, it's crazy that sounds revolutionary, but then you talk to people who are like, oh, I could never give feedback to my manager. I could never tell my boss what my struggle is because of XYZ. So if you get rid of that, it really can be that simple, folks.
Thanks, Joe. We're circling back to that psychological safety and modeling that Deborah talked about. Deborah, Robert, did you want to add or react to anything that Joe shared with us?
I will. The encouragement is, and I'm pretty sure Joe agrees with this and Deborah as well. If you're not going to actually implement, and it's not even about just implementing the suggestions, but if you're not really going to take them serious and plan to take some type of action towards them, it's almost better not even to ask. Because people get tired of being surveyed, focus grouped, interviewed when there isn't really any measurable, consistent, objective action or even a plan on how we're going to move from this. So don't just ask people how they feel for the sake of it. I even push against asking people, how are you doing? If you really don't care, don't ask me how I'm doing. But if you're going to ask, survey your employees, do focus groups, interviews, please, please, please actually do something with the data, present the data back to them. That's number one. And then also build a plan with them, not for them, but actually work with them. One of the fancy words is co-production. Another word is community engagement. But whatever strategy you're planning on building, build that in concert, in partnership with your employees, not in isolation in a boardroom.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. I was laughing while you were talking because it was reminding me of I do some training in communication skills too for healthcare providers, and a nurse asked me once during a workshop, how many times do I need to ask the patient what they know before I go ahead and tell them what I was going to tell them anyway? And the answer is, well, 0, because if you're just gonna if the answer to the question doesn't matter, don't ask the question. Just do your thing. It's a little more respectful than pretending to ask a question. And I wanted to highlight and kind of raise up a little that the premise of the question, how do we measure, is that you have some idea in mind of how you would be able to tell that your efforts are successful. And that sort of I think dovetails with what Joe and Robert were both saying of just if you're not going to be able to tell how your efforts are successful, just don't even, because why are you even getting started? have a goal in mind, be able to understand what the difference between success and failure, or success and need to do better, would be, and then get started from there.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm going to come back to Robert, and I feel like you gave us some information on this question already, but maybe you have a little more to add. What role do inclusive leadership and management practices play in promoting mental health or mental well-being among employees?
Can you repeat that one more time?
All right, Robert, you're a little bit frozen.
Sorry, I said, could you repeat that one more time?
Yep. What role do inclusive leadership and management practices play in promoting mental well-being among employees?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I won't say it sets the foundation. Because I think at this point, like, we've learned, especially people from communities and groups that have historically experienced discrimination and oppression, like, that you can't rely on another person necessarily for your health and wellness or to be safe. And I think Joe answered that kind of like in the first question. And just us coming into our work environment and having some resiliency. But leaders can be leaders really by, I think it's that humility piece. It's the humility piece. It's being teachable. And I think even having some type of eagerness, or even if there's not the emotion of eagerness, that there's a consistent action, like you actually want to learn about your employees and what they go through. And so if you don't know that, one of your employees has a family that maybe just immigrated and migrated to the US, you don't know that they may be having some concerns about around like law enforcement and things of that nature. And you're wondering maybe why their productivity has decreased since, some other point in time, then you probably are starting to form your own opinions and own assumptions, likely if you're like most of us. But like the healthy thing to do, the appropriate thing to do is really to sit down and start asking questions. Don't assume. Let's ask questions. And so I think by leaders being humble, being teachable, and practicing really good listening, that they can just simply by having a better understanding and context of what our employees are actually going through. I think that helps us to be more loving and more gracious and more kind and more patient with people as they navigate significant transitions and stressors within their own life, and then within the lives of their families, and then even within the lives of their communities.
Thanks, Robert. Joe and Deborah, I'll give you just a second if you want to add anything, but then I'm going to transition into a few questions from our audience.
Well, I'm good with
All right. You're going to have to excuse me. I'm going to read this closer to my face because my eyes are getting old. So here's a question from one of our audience members. I appreciate the discussion of cultural humility and the acknowledgement that our experiences differ and our differences are not superior or inferior to another. Any advice on how to drive that home to leaders who do not fully grasp that concept and try to leverage religion and politics against organizational LGBTQ plus efforts? For example, wanting to pull back on Pride Month initiatives because it's a political stance.
Joe, do you want to hop in first, or do you want me to?
No, go ahead, Robert, because I'm taking a breath before I respond so that I don't respond
Okay.
from a place of frustration.
I'm on this, so I'll like context. This is not specific context to the LGBTQ plus part. This is just personhood and humanity. So Dr. Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, if any of you all have read A Just Mercy or seen the movie with Michael B. Jordan a few years ago, A Just Mercy. So Dr. Stevenson talks about the power of proximity. When you're close to somebody, they're not, oh, that immigrant, or they're not, oh, that poor person. Like, they're Joe, they're Robert. they're Deborah. They're not this thing that you labeled them. And so one of the things that leaders can really do is to become proximal, one, to their employees, right? Like if you don't, and I'm not saying you have to know every employee, but like if you don't regularly spend time with your employees who are in a very different leadership structure and part of the company than you do, then like how are you actually legitimately and authentically leading them? The other part that I would say, and this is similar to and parallel to that, is that you should actually know who your community is. Like how many times do you attend council meetings? How many times are you going to school board meetings? And this is doesn't have to be a weekly thing, but like at what point in your organization's fiscal year do you actually like take time to pause and intentionally go in, not to provide solutions, but just to be present. Like, yeah, communities do need your money. And it's also considerate and maybe even equally as profound to just simply be present. And so if you're not present, then yeah, you're going to feel like it's innately and intrinsically a political move when it could legitimately be like, hey, like my family fled because the government was systematically killing this group of people. Like this is a political strategy. This is literally my family trying to live and just to simply be human. And so I think the short answer to all of what I'm saying is to be proximal, be intimate, be close to whatever the group is that you're calling the other, and actually like sit down and have a meal with them. Like simple as legitimately sitting down and having a meal or coffee.
Thanks, Robert. Joe, are you ready?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you for taking the lead on that, Robert. And I couldn't agree more. And the people who I was thinking about when you were responding and talking about proximity was my parents. You know, my parents weren't expecting to have a queer child. They had to learn a lot, and they learned from that, all of that. They learned about my community and about my experience from being in proximity to me, right? And my mother affectionately calls this the backyard effect, because now my parents teach in their church. They teach other parents about what it's like to integrate spirituality with having an LGBTQ child. And so they talk about this idea of not knowing what to do until you know someone. Now, is that always a possibility? No. But what Robert said, I think still rings true, is being in touch with the things that are bigger than just the space that you work in. Because even if you work at, I would say, regardless of the space that you work in, if you think that that company or that organization doesn't have some kind of impact on that community, you are lying to yourself. Just by the very fact that you are in that community and the people who work there are in that community too, the organization is there. So I want to say that. And I want to offer this other piece, that if the person who asked this question is a part of the community, you might need an ally in this kind of situation, right? And this is why allyship and accomplishship is also a part of this. And whether that is someone who's in the administration or it's another colleague, but despite my tenacity today, I have not always been this person who could fight for these kinds of things in the workplace, because I was brand new and I was scared and I was worried what people were thinking of me. And there wasn't that culture of safety. And so sometimes I didn't know what to do. And I really had to rely on my allies in the workplace who could have these conversations with me, because the idea that, Pride Month is a political stance, I think is intimately tied to the fact that being like celebrating LGBTQ pride only benefits LGBTQ people, because it doesn't. It benefits everyone. The same way that, practicing anti-racism in any space doesn't just benefit people who experience racism. It's actually, from a health perspective, it's better for everyone, right? And you get into I think the more human space of it. So the if the whoever's asking this question, and for anybody, also feels safe to have this conversation, you can talk about the impact of politicalization, if I hope I'm saying that right, of issues that are really not political and are actually more human. Now, we can't take them out of the context of being politicized in our political system, but the truth is that this is only a political issue because we in the socio-political sphere have said it is. It's really not. It's a person issue, and it's a belonging issue. You might also be able to talk to this person about the impact of not doing that, right? Or maybe if sometimes I think companies might be afraid to take these stances because of their shareholders or because of their external stakeholders who might react negatively to that. In the role I'm in now, I'm going to tell that person I would be happy to help you educate those people on why this is important and maybe there's some resources or some partnership that I could offer to you as an employee. Or if I'm a leader and I'm worried about how are people going to react to me doing this thing in the workplace, I'm like, okay, well, maybe I need to partner with an external resource to help me educate these other people to get them to understand why it is important. And you hope that the person you are educating is open to that kind of education. I think that's maybe a lot more than I was planning on saying. But the thing that I would leave it to is the not taking a stance on something like that because you're worried about it being a political stance, or not celebrating something, not acknowledging a very real experience, not just Pride Month, really anything, whether it's any kind of Heritage Month, whether it is recognizing that Columbus Day should really be Indigenous Peoples Day, whether we're talking about Juneteenth. The impact of not doing that on the employees that feel very passionately about recognizing that experience, that's also what you have to think about. And, tying it to what we talked about earlier, is you will signal to those people that they do not belong in your space. And that's really the big impact of pushing back on something like that. And it can recycle feelings of being stigmatized, not belonging, experiencing actual violence. And I know that might sound extreme, but you've just signaled to that person that they don't really matter, right? And if that's because you don't totally understand how that would happen, then to Robert's point, you need to be teachable about why that's important. I'm off my soapbox now.
That feels like a good note to wrap us up on. I want to thank our audience for your great questions, and I was trying to keep up with the chat. Great conversation happening there. And thank our panelists for their wonderful bits of knowledge throughout our panel. I'm going to hand it back to Emily to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you again to everyone who was able to join us for this meeting. Please don't sign off yet. We do have some events to talk about, upcoming NDC events we would love to engage your organizations and teams in. And then we also have the after the chapter discussion, in which we will give all attendees mic access and be able to talk and really engage more. I know the chat was filled with comments and really great ideas that we were all sharing. So we'd love to continue that into the after the chapter discussion. What I will do now is actually go ahead and show you some of our upcoming events. We will be hosting our National AA and HPI Leadership Summit very soon, less than 1 week away, on May 28th in New York City. It's actually an in-person and virtual event, so it is hybrid. If you have not heard about this event, we encourage you to scan the QR code on your screen to learn more. We're very excited to have BD Wong as our keynote speaker and would love for you to be in attendance next week for this event. Again, you can join virtually, just like today's chapter meeting, or in person at New York Life. We also encourage you to celebrate LGBTQ+ unity with us. We are very excited to be holding multiple Pride events with the NDC. Again, scan the QR code for more information. There will be a virtual LGBTQ+ Unity Summit happening in the month of June. We also have our Latino Leadership Conference coming up in September. We're very excited. This is one of our larger events. It's a 2-day conference. So more information, please scan the QR code Our theme this year is Latino Leaders, Inspiring Transformation and Igniting Change. And our last event is our National Black Men in Leadership Summit, which will be taking place in October 23rd and 24th in Detroit, Michigan. This is an in-person event, so we encourage you to scan the QR code to learn more about this event as well. Okay, welcome back. Thank you so much for hanging on the line with us. And now at this time, I am going to allow all participants to unmute themselves. So we should all have access now to our microphones. If we would like to get this conversation started, I please ask that you raise your hand to signal to me that you would like to speak, and then the floor would be yours. We'd love to have someone start us off, maybe with a reaction to the conversation or an idea that one of our panelists sparked for you.
Excuse me, this is Matt Weimuller. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm having issues with my assistive technology. How are you all doing? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Matt, thank you for joining today. We're so happy to have you here. Did you have a question or a comment?
A little bit of both. I'll
Sure.
try to keep it really brief. But I was just wondering if anyone had kind of encountered maybe something that I've been dealing with and have some advice. So I am totally blind. I can't see. I was born with an eye disease called Leber's. Recently, this past January, unfortunately, I came down with what has only been pretty much diagnosed as an upper respiratory illness. It was rather severe. I actually had to be revived for 6 minutes and was on a ventilator and dialysis and almost didn't wake up. They told my family I was going to most likely pass away, and miraculously was able to recover, and I'm doing much, much better now. And I won't go into those details. What I will say is that when I did wake up in the hospital that I was at, unfortunately, they were not very well equipped to deal with somebody with a visual disability. They didn't have Braille on any of their facilities, and had a rather unfortunate experience the very first night of my recovery with a couple of doctors and nurses. Just basically communication. They use a lot of your eyesight as a basis for cognitive functions, and so of course, because they couldn't make eye contact or see how my eyes were working, assumed that I was, almost brain dead, and there was some miscommunications. And so I was just wondering, of course, this was extremely, extremely, just comforting, because I was, of course, already dealing with a bad situation of just, waking up in the hospital, not knowing what was going on. And even after my family helped me out a lot and dealt with it. But was just kind of wondering what advice people would have for somebody like myself and further educating and kind of like, who are those people that you kind of reach out to in the future as kind of a follow-up as somebody who's greatly involved with DE&I, regarding something like this that may have occurred, and if anybody has any similar stories or advice, for the future of things like that. As obviously my health is going to be a tremendous thing, and I'm going to probably continue to kind of deal with situations like this. Did that make any sense? Could y'all hear me?
It did.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good. And thank you for sharing that. Thank you for your transparency, your vulnerability. And I'm glad, I thank God that you're still alive. That is, serious is an understatement. And so it's a blessing and amazing that you're still alive. I think from a very practical standpoint, the idea of having a patient advocate, and that advocate can be your family. It can be somebody within the hospital system potentially. But it's usually a good idea for you to and not you specifically, but individuals, whenever we're going into a healthcare facility, it is recommended to have at least one other person with you. Especially if you're undergoing a procedure, and obviously you didn't choose for this to happen. You didn't know that this was going to happen. But I would say from a practical standpoint, having somebody with you, a patient advocate, officially, or even if it's just not just a family member, but it could be a family member as well. From a more framework, it's not necessarily philosophical, but from a larger standpoint, the Office of Minority Health has what's called the National Class Standards, and CLASS stands for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services. And so hospitals, health systems, to a certain extent, are kind of required, encouraged to abide by these sets of guidelines that, as they say, provide culturally and linguistically appropriate services. And so ideally there should have been, hopefully, somebody within that specific healthcare facility that would have been able to provide context, cultural context in terms of the visual disability that you have experienced. But again, from a very practical, like you standpoint, I would say always having somebody with you when you can, obviously, like when there's advance notice, having somebody to attend healthcare appointments with you, because it does really help to have somebody you love, somebody that you trust, and somebody that can support you as you're navigating anything within healthcare, but especially when we talk about procedures and things of that nature.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And I did actually have I worked through all of it and was able to have a family member with me actually the entire time I was in the hospital, and we worked through it. And I had some great doctors. That's why I'm here. But again, it was just some interesting. It was very kind of shocking, to be honest with you, to see that these very, very intelligent, smart people, didn't know how to communicate with somebody with a visual disability, and had to do a lot of advocating myself and my family member to kind of educate people. And we worked through it. Everything's going well now, but it was a very interesting experience, on top of everything I was dealing with. So thank you for your comments. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt and Robert. Matt, again, we are just so thankful that you are with us and healthy and moving in the right direction. And thank you for your question. I see Amber, your hand is raised. Would you like to contribute?
Hi. First of all, I really want to thank all the panelists. That discussion was timely for me in a lot of ways. I am not in a position of leadership at my organization, but one of the things that I am working on with our DEI team is starting a wellness employee resource group that also includes mental wellness. Um, do you have any advice about bringing up difficult subjects in a professional setting and being mindful of the needs and conversation of other folks that are here? My story is very long and complicated, and I'm not going to get into it here, but I want to be respectful and mindful of the feelings of others when we approach this very, very sensitive subject matter.
Would one of our panelists like to take this question, or opening it up to other attendees to see if we can help Amber out?
Well, I'll jump in briefly, but I was sort of holding off a little because I'd be interested to hear if there are others here who have participated in similar initiatives. And that, so first of all, kudos for including mental health as health and placing those issues on the table. And I think some of what you, just even in the way that you were kind of phrasing the question, I think was, really addressed an awareness that'll be essential going forward, of sort of that balance between we place the issues on the table and we respect that maybe different people are going to have different comfort zones, either talking about themselves or kind of hearing about distressing topics, whether it's physical health or mental health. Again, even if it were only a kind of health and wellness related, there would still kind of physical health and wellness related, there would still kind of need to be a path to walk between really getting things on the table that everybody can discuss, and where do we cross the border into TMI territory. So I think thinking about it as, the more we can think about it as similar to discussing any other personal issue that affects large numbers of people, the more likely you are to end up in the place that's, if not right 100% of the time, at least course correctable, because I think that's also something else that we need to keep in mind when we talk about, asking people to be teachable. That also means that we give ourselves and others the room to sometimes make mistakes or not get it 100% right the first time.
Thank you so much for the insight. I want to do things right. And I said it in the chat while everybody was talking, but if my story, if other people's stories can help one other person, then I feel that people have somewhat of an obligation to share them. But at the same time, I don't want to put myself or my organization into a position where we open mouth insert foot. So thank you so much for the insight on that. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Amber and Deborah. Kara, I see your hand is raised. You have the floor next.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Cara Spencer. I'm coming from Cleveland, Ohio at the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. And I appreciate all of the insight and the feedback I got today. My question is kind of to anyone, really. But we were talking about kind of mental health, and we were talking about how you kind of break apart or remove the stigma surrounding that. And so my question is, what is folks' best advice for working through the differences that often show up in generational diversity? And so how do we work through those to then remove the stigma around mental health in this professional setting? And then kind of how does that process look, I guess?
Deborah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, because I struggle to not have this answer feel like a cop out. I really do, but my mind does go right to education. Like the helping people understand what mental health really is, how it shows up, and doing it in a way that kind of meets where they're at, because you mentioned generational differences, Cara, and I am trying to think of the different conversations I have had with older folks in my life, or folks who were come from generational spaces where mental health wasn't talked about or they didn't believe in it, and I will admit, as a therapist, I use a bit of my therapeutic skill there to get them to talk about, challenges that they might have had, or getting them to kind of reflect on their own mental health or how they were not allowed to talk about it. And I realize that's not always realistic in the workplace. So I come back to that education, but making sure that the education is like very particularly framed for that audience. I think a through line for that is really, couching it as a wellness dimension, or couching it as overall health, is something that's been helpful. And I hope I'm speaking to your question, but that's really where my mind goes. And I think the reason it feels challenging to answer that question is because that person has to be willing to be taught and to learn, and sometimes that's really the sticking point.
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump in, because another thing that makes the question a little difficult in a general sense, and we do, of course, have to respond generally, and to build on what Joe was saying, is the education needs to be specific and relevant, and thinking about and sort of appropriate for the context. That if we're talking about mental health in terms of kind of wellness and resiliency and having sort of a healthier workforce generally, they might approach it a little bit differently than if we want to address, supporting supporting staff members whose children are receiving mental health treatment. Just to think of a couple of, sort of workplace appropriate, but are going to be, kind of widely, the content and the approach is going to be very different. And I think if there are, yes, I see narrative storytelling. There are a lot of things that can be brought in. Something else that if you're talking about generational diversity, chances are you're talking about a large enough workplace where other people are also experiencing, um, you know, there are going to be a wide range of views already represented, and there may be places where the subgroups within the organization already recognize sort of some of these uh, changes and need to be able to address um, in terms of changing norms, changing mores, and I'm speaking very generally because I'm working my way around to how does this dovetail directly with a presentation, for example, that I was just involved in last week, where our Asian American affinity group asked for a panel on accessing mental health care, sort of recognizing that within that broad cultural group, there has historically been stigma around mental health, and that a newer generation was kind of saying, okay, we're ready to challenge the stigma, but okay, then what? So that was a completely different kind of education that was supporting employees who were sort of at the point of, okay, we're ready to challenge some of this generational stigma. Where do we go from here? What's the next step that we take? What would happen if I decided I wanted to see a therapist? So education, but kind of targeted, goal-oriented, and workplace appropriate.
To circle back on that and to echo what Robert dropped in the chat, I can't underestimate the power of narratives, again, in however they might be appropriate. But I used to be a substance use counselor, and the unbelievable things that people would say to me about what they thought about people who were in active addiction, what they thought about substance use, was heartbreaking and at times traumatizing. And I found that if I had the opportunity, providing a little bit of education about how addiction really happens and its connection to trauma, and also talking about what it was like for me to be an addiction professional, oftentimes went a long way. And even if I didn't see massive progress, I could tell that I at least put a pin in this person's thoughts about it, and that hopefully they would also stop saying really horrible judgmental things to people about addiction. And sometimes I could share clinical stories, but I would also share that addiction touches my family, and how I've seen that kind of come through intergenerational spaces, and to connect to something that Robert said earlier. Sometimes that helps people give proximity to the thing that they're wanting, that they have questions about, or that they're not sure about, or that they don't believe in.
Thank
Cara,
you.
oh, sorry.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
Never
Go
mind.
ahead,
No, it's
Robert.
okay. It's okay. Cara, she raised her hand for a follow-up question, so I'll I'll go back on mute.
I'm so sorry. I have one more follow-up. So to that point, so if it's helpful, I probably should have put a little context, but I work in this DEI space. We have quite a few employee resource groups in my organization, and we're currently working in this wellness space, but I find myself to be a person who is not here for checking a box because it looks nice. I am often a person who's like, if we're saying we're doing the work, let's actually do the work, and let's make sure that it's showing up in that space. And so my follow-up to that is in utilizing this education piece and making sure folks are understanding mental health challenges and understanding how they show up in the workplace, and then in understanding, Robert, to your point, some of that ROI, how many days are missed. How can we kind of ensure that we're balancing that we're balancing, that folks understand these challenges and how they show up, and then actually allowing the space for people to show up with these challenges in the workspace, if that makes sense.
Cara, can you repeat the last part of that question?
Yeah, so like how do we balance between, because I don't want to be directly in people's lives, but I'm struggling to find the balance between how do we allow people to show up in the workspace? We understand they have mental health challenges, so how do we balance understanding that that's just reality, and then ensuring that we're actually doing the work in this space to kind of break down that stigma for when people show up that way?
So yeah, I think it can be delicate depending on the organization and like how much. And it's not necessarily. I mean, part of it is how much does the organization value transparency and authenticity and vulnerability. The other part of it may be like more in the like programmatic and kind of like very like extremely granular practical standpoint. But like, can you all have employee resource group? Sorry, not a employee resource group, a employee support group that like allows people to have open and honest conversations. Can you all connect with the Celebrate Recovery? There are lots of them. I mean, they're throughout the entire country and they're global. Like, can you all connect with facilitators and organizations that can come in maybe on a monthly basis to facilitate conversations that allow people to be vulnerable and transparent about some of the challenges that they're engaging in experiencing? So like I think like the organization doesn't have to be the expert in that. Organizations shouldn't try to be the expert in that. And they should look for resources and organizations that can come in and partner with them to support their employees in a more intentional and specific way that's not necessarily beyond their capabilities, but that pulls on experts and subject matter experts in those specific areas to help them love on and to support their employees to be healthy and fun.
Thank you, Robert. Deborah, Joe, Alicia, do you have anything to add to that, or should we move on to maybe one last question? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Kelsey, I see that you're on screen. Would you like to share or ask a question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Emily. And I just want to thank the speakers and Alicia for this incredible conversation today, and Emily for putting it together so impactful, and to everyone who shared their stories and been vulnerable, both, vocally and in the chat. We really truly appreciate it. And it's meant a lot to me as well. I wanted to ask if the presenters have any practical advice for team members, employees, managers, if you have concern for a fellow employee, let's say they're making comments or you've noticed changes, or they're making jokes relevant to as a trigger warning, like making jokes around like self-harm or anything like that in a workplace. How do you go about addressing that? If you have any practical tips or around escalating that situation, if you feel concern. And the reason I as an example, I have a sister who works in the veterinary field, and she had a colleague who made a joke around something like that as they were doing medical practice on an animal, and she ended up having to escalate it, and it turned out that there was a concern and there was a plan in place. So just any tactical advice or practical advice you have around that.
Okay, so I see Robert putting into the chat about mental health first aid, which is training that's maybe available. But certainly, the one thing that I know I'll always make available when discussing any kind of mental health related issue is the 988 hotline for anybody to be aware of. Because the key thing, I think, is, if somebody is particularly concerned about the possibility of an immediate kind of crisis, that they should feel like they have an easy resource to access, and that they don't have to have the expertise or be able to manage it themselves. Um, you've got experts to go to. You've always got somebody to help who's available to help, even if you work in the most backwards organization where nobody can talk about any of it, or you feel uncomfortable raising it directly to the person or to a supervisor. That resource is always available and should be widely shared. If you're doing Mental Health Awareness Month or any other kind of initiatives around health and wellness, to be sure that people have it there. Then beyond that, certainly being able to I think anything that allows people to have a resource so that they feel safe, because they're not going to necessarily feel that that just because they've noticed it and they've brought it up, that now it's their problem to solve. You don't even want that. You don't necessarily want that even in organizations where, lots of people have clinical training. But rather that they have resources, there's somebody there who has their back.
Just to jump off of that, and I love that we're putting these resources in the chat, kind of to connect your question with Kara's question. As part of the education that we should be doing in organizations, if you're in an organization that is really committed to actually addressing mental health issues, you have to train every single person on suicide screening, not just folks who might be in clinical roles. And the one that Alicia dropped in, QPR, that is not just for therapists. QPR, the question, persuade, refer method is a excellent training method to teach people how to talk about suicide with people in their spaces, because that's really the thing I think you're pushing up against here is, how do I ask somebody about that? I train therapists, and I don't ever want anyone to get the idea that it's really easy to ask someone, are you thinking about killing yourself, right? It's a heavy question to ask someone, but it is so essential to be able to ask it directly, and to be able to, if you're a person who feels safe to do so, to open that line of communication with that person, because maybe nobody has ever asked them. And I specifically mean that language. You can't ask somebody if they're thinking about hurting themselves, right? You have to be specific. And QPR training is relatively simple. You don't, like I said, you don't have to have a clinical background for it, but it really gives you the conversational tools, not just like how to do something like a Columbia suicide screen. It is about facilitating conversations around safety and lethality. So I love QPR. I'm trained, best thing I ever did.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of these amazing resources that you have put into the chat, and for explaining so much about your knowledge and expertise. And really, the goal is to make the workplace somewhere where we can all be ourselves and feel safe and comfortable and appreciated. So today's conversation was absolutely incredible, very, very knowledgeable, and we're just really excited that you were able to contribute, and all of our attendees definitely gained knowledge today. So in closing, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to each of you for your participation and engagement. We've really come together to create an impactful and meaningful conversation together. As we conclude, let's carry these insights and inspirations forward to a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable future. For our attendees, I had gotten a few questions about HRCI and SHRM credits. We will be following up via email shortly after our meeting concludes, and that email will include the program ID information to claim your HRCI and SHRM credits. At this time, we again thank our panelists and our amazing moderator so much for your participation today, and I am going to display our feedback survey QR code. Attendees as well as panelists and moderator, we encourage everyone to take this post-event survey. Your survey results are read. We read every single one of them that comes in. We think about the feedback, and we really do try to take that feedback and make our future programming that much better. So going back to, like we said in the meeting, it's not enough to just survey and then do nothing with the data. We really do survey and then use this data to improve our future programming. So again, thank you so much to everyone who has attended with us, and please look for that follow-up email. We're right at 1:30 now. So I'd like to say goodbye and have a great rest of your day to everybody. I'll leave the survey code up for a few more minutes so that you can go ahead and scan that with your camera. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone, and please come back and join us for our next chapter meeting next month.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.